Just recently, Apple has officially announced its most powerful chips ever in its illustrious history as a tech company. The M1 Pro and M1 Max are beefed up versions of the M1 chip that is debuted last fall to associate its new MacBook Pro models. The original M1 chip was announced a little less than a year ago as Apple's first in-house ARM-based chip for laptops. At launch, it was featured in Apple's revamped MacBook Air, 13-inch MacBook Pro, and entry-level Mac Mini, in addition to the 2021 iMac and iPad Pro refreshes. Coming back to the new and highly revamped chips of Apple, the M1 Max and M1 Pro distinguishably differ in terms of peak performance, with the M1 Max doubling some important contributors to theoretical performance, notably the number of hardware ProRes accelerators, which is extremely important for pro video editing, and doubled bandwidth for some internal interfaces like that between memory and the processor. Speaking of memory, the M1 Max doubles the memory bandwidth up to 400 GB per second and RAM up to 64 GB of memory. In terms of GPU, the numbers are even more mind-boggling. The M1 Max with its 32 cores and 4096 execution units is 4 times the GPU performance of the original M1. The M1 Max features 57 billion transistors, making it the largest chip that Apple has ever made. The new chip also means that you can connect up to 4 external displays to a single device. Enough to chat about the numbers. This video is all about what the real-world performance numbers witness for these new M1 chips from Apple. I have compiled performance figures from different sources for these amazing Apple silicons. When it comes to Blender, the numbers that these M1 chips producing are staggering. Bear in mind, Blender is optimized for Apple in-house silicons. Rendering Party Thug within Blender produced just 5.9 seconds for the M1 Max and a whopping 33.5 seconds for the AMD Radeon Pro 5600 and with its 40-core GPU. The amazing thing is, according to MaxTech, the fans were not even used while doing the Blender test on the M1 Max. However, the AMD GPU needed a full blast fan cooling during the Party Thug render test. Adobe Photoshop is among the apps that runs natively on the Apple M1 silicon. According to Photoshop Cafe, loading a 3.6 GB and 68 layers PSD file took just 9.9 seconds for the M1 Max 16-inch and 16 seconds for the 16-inch MacBook Pro with Intel i9 processor. Doing a GPU-empowered smart blur effect with radius of 50 and threshold of 25 took the 16-inch Intel i9 MacBook Pro with Radeon Pro 5500, 64 GB of RAM, 59 seconds, and the M1 Max 34.6 seconds, according to Photoshop Cafe. Bear in mind that this smart blur effect is done with high-quality settings. Scaling up the same image to 300% with re-rendering all the smart objects to produce 20,000 by 17,000 pixel image using biopic interpolation. The Intel i9 with Radeon Pro 5500 took 1 minute 29 seconds and the M1 Max took just 55 seconds to render. While the GPU of the M1 Max is outperforming its Intel counterpart, the 10 CPU cores that the M1 Max packs continued with the same trend. Again, according to Photoshop Cafe, a radial blur testing in Photoshop, which tasks the CPU significantly, the 16-inch Intel i9 processor in the MacBook Pro took 5 minutes and 14 seconds, and the M1 Max only 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Another staple for photo editing enthusiasts is Adobe Lightroom. Thing worth remembering here is Lightroom is more optimized for Apple Silicon than Photoshop, so it's natural to expect better results. Credit goes to MaxTech channel for these side-by-side test results. Merging 942 megapixel raw image to an HDR or a high dynamic range imaging took the Intel i9 5600M 3 minutes 19 seconds and only 2 minutes 4 seconds for the M1 Max, according to MaxTech. Exporting 5042 megapixel image in Lightroom Classic only took the M1 Max just 1 minute and 21 seconds. The Intel i9 MacBook Pro needed 3 minutes and 5 seconds. This is 2.3 times faster for the M1 Max, which is very impressive results and shows that Lightroom is more optimized for Apple Silicon than Photoshop. The advantage of having a unified memory in these M1 chips is also showcased here. Final Cut Pro is Apple's in-house video editing software and much loved by many content creators and video enthusiasts that adheres to the Apple ecosystem. So it is well known by now that this video editing tool is highly optimized to run on these Apple home-based silicons. According to MacRumor site, rendering a 6 minutes 4K video footage using M1 Max in Final Cut Pro just took 1 minute and 49 seconds, 2 minutes and 55 seconds for the M1 Pro. In terms of rendering 8K raw footage, the M1 Max took it as a champion, and M1 Pro also did fantastically despite frame drops here and there. For comparison, the 2017 Mac Pro with all the jaw-dropping desktop-grade hardware it packs could not do well in rendering out 8K raw footage as well as the 14-inch M1 Pro. MaxTech has also done a comparison test between M1 Max and the Intel i9 MacBook Pro using Final Cut Pro's motion tracking tool to analyze an 18 seconds clip. The Intel i9 with its beefy 5600M graphics card took about 31 seconds. However, the M1 Max processes the clip in only just 6 seconds. Here we have to appreciate the background computation through the new Apple Neural Engine on these M1 chips. Davinci Resolve is one of the most popular video editing tools out there. Again, according to MaxTech, GPU-intensive video stabilization of a 1 minute 4K footage took the M1 Max an amazing 28 seconds to process, but the Intel i9 with its 5600M GPU took 46 seconds for the same task. Exporting a 5-minute clip with high-efficiency video coding or H265 using Davinci Resolve only took the 16-inch M1 Max 1 minute and 19 seconds, and the Intel i9-based MacBook Pro took 2 minutes and 39 seconds to export. The major factor for these differences in export time is newly introduced and much faster video encoder in these M1 chips compared to the Intel MacBook Pros. The most impressive result though produced when exporting a 6K Blackmagic RAW to ProRes 422 only took 1 minute and 13 seconds for the M1 Max. However, the Intel i9 based MacBook Pro couldn't even crack the 2-minute mark and it exported to a slow 4 minutes and 5 seconds. Apple is not well known in making an A-list gaming machines. Additionally, these M1 chips are not meant to be high-end gaming rigs. However, considering the benchmark figures that these new Apple Silicons registering from other aspects of personal computing, it's reasonable to test their gaming prowess against the high hitters. These gaming benchmark numbers were taken from the AnandTech website. In GFX Bench 5.0 Aztec Ribbons high 1440p off-screen, the M1 Pro performs admirably and even ahead of the RTX 3060 laptop GPU, which uses an Intel i9 11980HK processor. The M1 Max, on the other hand, produced even more impressive results by overtaking AMD's base in the form of the Radeon 6800M, which uses a Ryzen 9 5900HX processor, and coming very close to the RTX 3080 with i9 11980HK. The MacBook Pro 16 with M1 Max registered as 309.3 frames per second compared to 315 frames per second for the RTX 3080 based Raider. The gaming performance, however, takes a huge hit for these M1 chips when compared to the RTX 3080 for instance, while using a shadow of the Tomb Raider test with its highest settings. In this case, the M1 Max 16-inch produced a mere 85 frames per second compared to the RTX 3080 and the Intel i9 1190HK equipped MSI machine which produced 140 frames per second. Again, as I have said above, these M1 equipped Apple laptops are not meant to be a AAA gaming machines. According to MaxTech, the M1 Max battery life barely took a hit when doing all the real-world performance comparison against an Intel i9 MacBook Pro. During this test, which lasted for 2 hours, the Intel machine almost completely ran out of juice, but the M1 Max only lost 50% of its battery life. Bear in mind that this M1 Max 16-inch carries a much higher quality display with its mini LED, which requires a lot more power compared to the Intel i9 based MacBook Pro that MaxTech has tested. Despite this, the M1 Max 16-inch still left with 49% battery life after 2 hours of extensive testing, while the Intel i9 MacBook Pro only left with a mere 3% of battery life. The introduction of the M1 chips cemented Apple's legacy as an undisputed leader when it comes to refining and presenting a class-leading tech product. The performance per wattage ratio of these ARM-based chips from Apple and rival companies will definitely set the standard in the future, as the world is vying for carbon neutrality and efficiency. Being the first adopter in any industry always helps to gain early advantage, and Apple sees this opportunity emphatically. Unless the likes of Microsoft, Samsung and Google quickly jump to the risk-based chip bandwagon and produce rivaling chips for these M1 beasts, Apple will possess the scepter for the foreseeable future in this market segment. Thanks for tuning in on the very first program came from this channel. Please do not forget to like, subscribe and share. Since it's a brand new channel, I desperately need all your support in every way possible. Thanks. God bless.